Welcome back. In this video, we're going to answer the question, what is educational policy? When you hear the word policy, what comes to mind? Many people think of policy as a written document, perhaps a law passed by government, a school handbook, university regulations, or a strategic plan. These are all important examples of policy. But are policies simply documents? Or is policy something larger that shapes decisions, actions, and educational life? In this video, we will explore what educational policy really means. Educational policy is not something that exists only in government offices or policy documents. It shapes the everyday experiences of people throughout educational systems. It influences students and their learning opportunities. It influences teachers and what they teach. It influences school leaders and how schools are organized. And it influences colleges and universities through funding, accountability, and institutional priorities. Whether we notice it or not, policy affects decisions, relationships, and practices across education. This is why understanding policy is an important part of understanding educational leadership. Before policies become documents, they begin as decisions. Educational systems constantly face questions about priorities and directions. What should students learn? Who should have access to educational opportunities? How should learning be assessed? How should resources be funded and distributed? And how should schools, colleges, and universities be organized? Every answer to these questions reflects a choice, and those choices eventually become policies. In this sense, policy is not simply a document. Policy is a way of deciding what matters and how educational systems should operate. One of the common ways people understand policy is as a written document. Policies often appear as legislation, regulations, strategic plans, or institutional policies. These documents communicate goals, expectations, responsibilities, and rules. They tell us what should happen and provide direction for educational systems. But a policy document by itself does not create change. A policy may be written perfectly on paper, yet produce very different outcomes in practice. To understand policy fully, we must look beyond the document itself and examine what happens when people begin to interpret and implement it. So, if policy is more than a document, what happens after the policy is written? Once a policy is introduced, people begin to interpret it, adapt it, and put it into action. This is where policy becomes practice. Teachers make decisions about teaching and learning, leaders make decisions about implementation and management, administrators allocate resources. Teams work together through relationships, conversations, and everyday problem solving. In other words, policy does not simply sit in a document. It comes alive through the actions and decisions of individuals and groups. This is why the same policy can look very different across schools, districts, colleges, and universities. Understanding policy means understanding both the text and the practice. But policy is not only expressed through documents or actions. It is also shaped by the ideas and beliefs that influence how people think about education. This brings us to our next perspective, policy as discourse. So far, we have explored policy as decisions, documents, and practice. But policy is also shaped by the conversations people have about education. Think about questions such as, what is quality education? What does equity mean? What outcomes matter most? And whose voices should influence decisions? The answers to these questions are not always the same. They are influenced by people's beliefs and values, their ideas about education, and the language they use to describe problems and solutions. They're also shaped by power, culture, history, media discussions, and whose voices are heard or ignored in policy debates. This is what we mean by policy as discourse. Policies emerge not only from documents and decisions, but also from the ways people understand, discuss, and give meaning to educational issues. We've now explored 4 different ways of understanding educational policy. First, policy can be understood as decisions. Policies emerge from choices about priorities, goals, and actions. Second, policy can be understood as text. These decisions are often communicated through legislation, regulations, strategic plans, and institutional policies. Third, policy can be understood as practice. Policies take shape through the actions, interpretations, and decisions of people in everyday settings. And finally, policy can be understood as discourse. Policies are influenced by ideas, values, language, and debates about what education should be. Each perspective helps us see something important. They provide a more complete understanding of educational policy. This broader understanding is essential because policy never operates in isolation. It interacts with governance, leadership, organizations, and people across education systems. And this is where HEPGA becomes useful. Before we move on, take a moment to think about a policy in your educational context and consider which of these 4 perspectives help you understand it best. We begin this video by asking a simple question. What is educational policy? Along the way, we explored policy as decisions, texts, practices, and discourse. Together, these perspectives help us see that policy is much more than a document. Educational policy exists within a larger system. It is influenced by governance structures that establish rules and responsibilities. It is shaped by leadership that provides direction and supports implementation. It operates through organizations that manage resources, processes, and daily operations. And it is experienced by people whose values, perspectives, and actions influence how policy unfolds in practice. Understanding educational policy therefore requires more than reading policy documents. It requires understanding how policies interact with governance, leadership, organizations, and people across educational systems. This broader system perspective is at the heart of HEPGA. In this video, we focused on educational policy. In the next video, we will take a closer look at governance and explore how governance shapes the way policies are interpreted, implemented, and experienced across educational systems.